All right, hello everyone. Welcome once again to the Cartoon Syndicate. I am once again Paul Densmore. And once again, we are here to look at comics and study a little bit of sequential art. You may be confused by the book on top because it doesn't quite match up with what this video is supposed to be about. But I wanted to kind of give a preview of what the next three videos will be on because we're going to be looking at three artists. Two of them are in this book, so Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, and then one of them in this book. And that's kind of a dead giveaway right there, Spider-Man by Todd McFarlane. So we're going to be kind of looking at three of the top 90s extreme artists, that late 80s, early 90s extreme artists, and pretty much throughout the entire 90s with the Image takeover and everything. But the reason that I have this on top is because it contrasts so well with what we're going to be looking at today, which is dun da da da, this book by Tezuka. So Dororo or Dororo, and I never know how to pronounce that, so that's going to make this really fun. I think it's Dororo, and I'll probably mispronounce it. Have to pronounce it twice, several times, because there's the one that my brain is naturally acclimated to, which is just to pronounce the O's the exact same way, and then there's the way that I can correct myself with the second time, which I believe is the correct pronunciation. So, Dororo. There you go. See, I have to do it twice every time. It's just the way my brain is wired. I apologize. This is one of the coolest books of all time. So we took a look at those two first because it contrasts so nicely with Tezuka's style. Because Tezuka, of course, we know from Astro Boy, and the ones that I really want to get, I don't have them yet. But I'm planning on getting them over the next year, which is the 8 volumes of his 8-volume biography of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. And so I would very much like to take a look at those. But today we're going to be taking a look at this giant omnibus edition. And of course we're not going to look at the entire thing. I'm going to pick out highlights. But the main thing I wanted to look at, and the way it contrasts with the other artists that we're going to talk about over the next three cycles. And of course this follows along with what we've been doing, looking at classic sequential artist, and it is the economy of style. So along that Alex Toth Roth road, yeah, Roth, and the economy of style, and also the language of comics. So the visual language of comics, which I think Eastern artists kind of trump Western artists in that style. So for instance, when we think of manga, we think of like the sweat beads popping off of someone to show exasperation or even surprise, or kind of, it's context sensitive. Meanwhile, if we think about Western comics, for the most part, if you've got a character that's sweating, it's simply because that character is sweating. He's overexerted. We think of, like, say, Wolverine. If we've got beads of sweat rolling down Logan's face, say he doesn't have his mask on or whatever, then we know that that's not necessarily showing exasperation. That's showing physical overexertion, etc. So and yet it could be used. If we go back to those Will Eisner comics, it's that sort of newspaper syndicate sort of economy of language, where that would fit in very well. So that, and Will Eisner's style is so interesting because he's able to both play with the realism and the cartoon style. And I kind of noted that. Even though it kind of gets mixed up a little bit in what he's trying to, he never really quite grasps, the line between the two. It's interesting to see him play with the two. So you could have a character that, is completely cartoony and almost the rubber hose style, and, have the sweat beads and everything showing exasperation. And meanwhile, you have the spirit who's all cut up and bleeding and dealing with the harsh, grim reality of the situation. But meanwhile, as we mentioned with the spirit, what worked so well in the comics didn't translate so well in the film. It's the exact same thing. It's because within the context of being, a syndicated newspaper cartoon, the spirit could get away with, having a ton of bricks dropped on his head and could just stand up at the end or whatever. But, to work in a film, Frank Miller had to translate that into, oh, he has a superpower where he's, nigh invulnerable. And it didn't quite work. So before we jump into this, and this is one that I haven't, usually I kind of go through the pages that I want, and I've already kind of got an idea in my head. But here I just kind of randomly selected some of my favorite scenes, and we're going to try to break it down and study, again, that economy of style. So let's go ahead and get into this. What differentiates them, and I don't want this to seem as if I'm coming down on, the other artists like Liefeld or McFarlane or Lee or any of them. They're masters of the art, naturally, and I mean, we're going to be looking at them in a very positive light coming up. And the stories that we're going to be looking at, for the most part, especially the X-Men stories, the Spider-Man stories by Todd McFarlane, we'll be looking at some of the drawbacks because he is writing those stories. And so he does kind of, essentially, it boils down to this one sentence. It's, style versus substance, or substance over style. And I think there's a happy meeting point between the two. I think that Kirby, I think Ditko, very much had that in mind, with trying to match, the flow, the pace of a comic story, and composition, everything, while also allowing their artistic style to come across. Because I think a lot of the problem with modern artists, and when I'm talking about currently, like 2000, 20 onward, and it goes well beyond that, is that it's almost, mainstream comics almost look the same. There are very few artists that really stand out. And if they are artists that stand out, it's because they've been around since, they're the holdover from like the 90s explosion. Or even alternative artists that have been kind of, brought into the more mainstream. But even then, they kind of, the yoke is put on them, the editorial yoke. And so I don't blame the artists at all, because these are all incredible artists. But there's an editorial yoke and even a writer's yoke, because we're focusing a little too much on the writing part and not enough on letting the artist flow. And you can say, I know I've seen interviews with writers these days who are quote unquote working in the Marvel style, Marvel books, and it's not really the Marvel style. They're still handing over a script. It may be a bare bones script, but it's not, Stan Lee saying, "Hey, Jack, you know, I want you to do, literally two sentences over a phone. Here's where we want to go in this." Um, or, "Hey, Steve, here's what I want you to do," and then give out two sentences, and then the rest is up to them, and then the writer steps back in. And so that the artist is so much calling the shots. It's that whole Alan Moore sort of mentality. And it's best hammered across by actually the way that I was taught to write comics. I've mentioned Mark Neese before, who taught me comic scripting 101 and 102, or 201, I think. But anyway, the two comic scripting classes that are legendary at the Savannah College of Art and Design. So much so that the film students often come in and take the comics script writing class to supplement the script writing work that they learn in over in the film department. I did the opposite. I took every class I could with Mark, but then I also took basic film classes as well. And James Sturm, who taught me, who's done some work with the Fantastic Four, and is most famous for his creation, The Mighty Golem, which is an incredible book. And he was working on, when he was teaching me Intro to Comics. Sturm was very much a film approach to comics, and I might kind of divulge away from that a little bit these days. But it's, again, as we've seen with Alex Toth, who, it's very cinematic. It's not a bad approach. And so much so that Sturm, would recommend that we take the film classes. That was kind of, also, most of my friends were filmmakers and still are. And, but he would recommend that we study like David Mamet and David Mamet's On Directing Film. He said, if you read On Directing Film and you really get it, then you've got everything that you need to make comics. Somewhat agree, somewhat disagree. But and as you'll see within Tezuka, there's a very cinematic approach. In fact, we're going to compare some of this stuff with actual, tropes within movies. And if I mispronounce any of this, please forgive me. I'm an ignorant peon at times. The very first thing that I want to point out, if you do pick this book up, on the back, I've seen McCloud. This is Scott McCloud. Understanding Comics is another one of those foundation pieces for sequential art. If you haven't read it, please read it. There are things that we're going to talk about within this that McCloud is famous for pointing out, sort of like the different panel transitions, etc., like moment to moment, scene to scene, etc. So McCloud, and I've seen this quote before, I had a bookcase filled with untranslated Tezuka that I studied like the Torah for hours on end. This is how I feel when I read this. It is like study. It's enjoyable to the nth degree, but I find myself having to go back over. So generally what I'll do is I'll read the 2 pages, and then I'll have to go back and study every single line, what's there and what's not there. Very much like a Toth approach to it, where it's not just, it's the substance. It's getting across the substance rather than just flash in your face style. Like sort of Liefeld can be when left to his own devices, or Lee and McFarlane are a little more restrained. But we're going to look at some of McFarlane's stuff in Spider-Man, that some of the compositions are innovative but distracting at the same time. So it's how can we learn to take this innovation, because we have to have that innovation. We have to have the style as an artist. If you're not getting your style across, everything, just like I said with the Marvel, the modern comics, and that's Marvel, DC, pretty much anything, is that it all blends together. It's all homogenous, and it's, to me, I don't even read much modern stuff anymore. If I do, I primarily read it for the writing. And again, that's that sort of writing approach. Oh, and the thing I wanted to talk about with Mark Neese and sort of that Alan Moore approach was, Mark would say at the very beginning of right, like the very first sentence, he would be like, okay, as a comic book writer, and this is probably the only thing that I've ever disagreed with Mark on, and he's sitting there knowing that he's talking to artists, but he's saying, as a comic book writer, when you're scripting, you have to think of the artist as an absolute idiot. and he literally would say this, which means that you have to spell out. So when you're going through, he was very much against the Marvel style, and he would say that is not writing. And he would say, you have to spell out every single thing, so that every single, the scripts that we would have to turn into them, they would be these massive Alan Moore tomes where like every single panel is, every single mark is basically delineated within the panel. And it would, if I were the artist on that, I mean, I think so many comic book artists, and I can say this from, personal experience, have degrees of being antisocial. And so if I'm handed that, it would kill my soul to the point where I'd be like, fuck, screw this, and throw the script in his face. So it's like, how can we... So we have to be able to get that style across. We have to be able to get our voice across. But also, how can we make sure that our voice and our style is not getting in the way of the substance, which is the story itself, which is the flow of the story. Okay? So we're going to look at this for flow. I mean, Tezuka has this amazing, and this, I love this, pretty much any manga is read for what we think of as backwards. So normally, this would be the front cover, and then we'd open to what we would think of as the first page. But right there, you're like, hey, wrong way. I love that it says, it may make you dizzy at first, which it will, but forcing your brain to do things backwards makes you smarter in the long run. We swear. Also true. So this was one a lot of crazy philosophers have said, to do things with your opposite hand, to do things backwards. So this is following in on that. So opening up, I think the opening scene is one of the most amazing, and it's almost stylistically slightly different than the rest of the book. But you see, we open on this amazing temple scene. But again, look at the economy of that. He's not adding in a whole bunch of cross-hatching that doesn't need to be there. These are simple line drawings, and the hatching follows the style, so that we know that rather than these just being arbitrary lines, these are individual shingles. Okay? Solid black. And not only that, but he's actually going through and erasing part of his work, so that we're left with these rain streaks. How many people would want to do that? Would want to spend so much time setting up an establishing shot and then go through and shoot, 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 shoot. So it's almost letting go of your pride. to serve the story. All right. And then we get in, again, look at the economy of these characters. Just a few lines. The only thing I will say is these patterns that he has on clothing is amazing. If you go through and you study these patterns, it's amazing. Again, look at that background. That's done in a way to make it look like haze in the rain, far off. And even how the onomatopoeia, he even factors that in the actual Japanese into the image, so much so that they don't want to erase those, because it's part of the image. And we may or may not see, but he plays with the onomatopoeia and the actual transliteration of them and translation of them so much. He's very fond of wordplay. And it's one of the things I love about him. So much so that it sets up this very atmospheric. It's setting up an atmosphere. Think about it. We have these cuts. We have these moment-to-moment cuts, as Scott McCloud would say. And Jessica Abel in her, what's it called? Drawing words and writing pictures, mastering comics. I only know them because they're sitting right there on the bookcase beside me. But those are excellent books, and we'll probably look at those at some point. But she factors in all of McCloud's sort of innovations or observations into this. But we have these moment-to-moment scenes where it's just like, okay, here's the action, boom, thunder crack, and how simple is that? We have this almost worm's eye view of a thunder crack, so that we're down here and the thunder starts small and comes down and grows towards us. But how simple, it's just negative space. It's just white against a black background. To footsteps, which gives us a little more action, but then we cut away where we are seeing the figures, but it's more about the rain. It's very, like Kurosawa almost. And then we get to like this cut to, just not necessarily random objects. They do serve the story. But like, again, this is more about action, but also to set up the atmosphere of it is a dark and stormy night. This panel is one of the ones I wanted to highlight. How many times in movies have we seen this very panel? Think about it. This dark silhouette of a figure, almost tiredly throwing open temple or church doors or something. I can think of The Crow. I can think of Lord of the Rings. I believe even before Tezuka used it, we would have seen things in some Universal monster movies. I believe Kurosawa has used it. And this amazing, again, the line work. So now we're getting into some line work and some hatching, but it's serving the lighting 100%. It's not just arbitrary marks thrown in. It's showing cast shadows on these statues of these demons. And again, this layering effect where it's almost a Bob Ross layering effect where we have these dark silhouettes in the foreground, and then the midground we have our characters being highlighted by this sort of halo of light coming off of this candle that's casting shadows onto the background, which are these demon lords, basically. All right. So essentially, the story itself is that this guy is kind of wants to be an emperor, and so he makes a deal with all these demon statues, demon lords, that they want a sacrifice, and they each want an organ. And so his wife's about to go into labor, And so he promises the baby's organs to, one organ per demon. So when he's born a monstrosity. And I won't go into all those. We mainly want to look at the art. But he is... let's just flip around while I'm talking. He is like a monstrosity. And look at how amazing this is, The wind blowing in, showing that, yes, you have been heard. And this boom, crack of, again, I said this is almost stylistically so much different than the rest of the book. I feel like more time was spent on that one splash page than pretty much every other panel in the rest of the book. And yet it has the effect, And he's a monstrosity, and he is sent off to, and he's basically, they pull a Moses on him. They stick him in a basket and sail him down, a river. He's found by a doctor and given artificial limbs and hair and glass eyes, because it's learned that he has these psychic senses and things. And later he's given swords for arms and legs. And so he's sent on a mission basically to retrieve his organs. And each demon that he kills, he gets an organ back. And these are some of the ones I wanted to highlight. Some of my favorite pages. This is him killing an invisible demon. He's got these sandals just walking, and you see he's got the swords for arms. So the prosthetic arm has come off. Whoosh. We get those amazing motion lines, these circular motion lines, and almost Kirby dots of blood splattering around. And then see just this economy of storytelling. It's like, let's spend 3 panels showing, this blood spurt. So it's like speed up to show the action, slow down to set pacing and atmosphere. Look at that. How can you draw a skeleton with the least amount of lines possible? That's what that is. I love this next page with the dog. The dog is just a silhouette, this demon dog. It's black the entire time. And yet we get so much emotion off of it. Okay. Next. Back to using my little thumbnail pages from Martian Mouth, which hopefully will be done relatively soon. This is one of my favorite little action sequences in here. This is where he's been tasked by the village with killing a demon that stole all of its money, but it turns out to be kind of the woman that was supposedly protecting the city. And so anyway, I love this bamboo. How it's almost sort of, it's like foreground and background and midground, So we have it running through each, and he plays with that, And this, where a character basically turns into motion lines itself. I love it when Kirby and Tezuka and Ditko and all of them do that. Action without extreme, this whole thing is an amazing action sequence. And yet there's nothing extreme. There's no real panel breaks. There's no... it's still sticking to this sequential sequence, and it's still an easily readable story. Even though we're reading it quote unquote backwards, you know, to our normal Western mind, it still easily flows once we learn how to look at it in the correct sequence, you know. Where is that one page? And look at these monsters that he draws. And he draws them so, again, it's like a pattern and lines and shadow, you know? And yet it works perfectly. And to say, look at these hatch marks. You know, there are so many people these days that if you use, I mean, Tezuka would have broken out a ruler and gone over, or maybe one of his assistants, I don't know. But they're so uniform. And there's so many people these days that would call, oh, duotone, that's fucking duotone, man. And it's not, you know, because you will see, well, I mean, you'll see inconsistencies in it, but there's one that I really wanted to highlight, and I wish I could find it. It was like one of the main things I wanted to show, that we can know that that's pretty much not duotone. There's one image in particular. Oh, man. Is that it? No, I thought it was right around there. But every now and again, you'll see that he'll go in and he'll crosshatch over those perfectly uniform lines. And again, they're not 100% completely uniform because we get almost lights and darks within them. And that's what gives us, you know, depth and the illusion of 3D. And it's doing it almost unconsciously, I think. This is one of my favorite panels right here. This is one of my favorite 2 pages. This is Dororo, who is not the guy that, so even though the book is named after him, he's basically this little punk thief kid. So he's not the samurai guy with swords on his arms and things. But we find out later that he was the son of like a bandit lord who got betrayed, and he and his mother died. He died in he was in his mother's arms when she died. She was keeping him warm from, they had gotten lost in a snowstorm and things like that. Very emotional. But this is kind of where we break into his backstory and his origin story, and it starts in the middle of this sequence where he's just kind of like, leave me alone, I don't want to talk about any of it. And so he kind of goes off just to be alone in, you know, in nature, and kind of be depressed and be sad and like just be alone. And he does these amazing hatching, which is not just straight, it's very circular and very pattern-like. I love it. But anyway, all of a sudden, the wind and the natural atmosphere breaks into the memory of his parents on, you know, his bandit parents on horseback. And it's done, again, so simply. Look at that grass. It's just solid black. It's silhouette. Mid-ground of, you know, a single cartoony character. He never gets away from the cartoon nature within his work to this really intricate background, and yet it's subdued enough. There's enough negative space, and and the hatching is light enough where it still stays in the background. And again, the onomatopoeia blends into the image itself. It's beautiful. Again, if you get this book, study it. Read it, but study it. It will give you so much within, again, just the economy of style, the economy of storytelling, sacrificing certain stylistic impulses to serve the flow of the story, but also equipping you with that language, motion lines, onomatopoeia, exasperated. Because if you really go into this, even look at this, a lot of the facial features are very, they're cartoony. They're very similar. Even you'll notice that a lot of the men and a lot of the women look the same. There's this one scene, and I thought I had it highlighted in here, where Dororo, this guy, is being beat up by this big burly dude, And then later, within that memory that we just kind of got a glimpse of, where I left, it goes into his father, who was this bandit lord, and they look almost exactly the same. And then several women in here look exactly the same as his mother. And so it's simplified cartoony style, but done in this very mature way that tells this beautiful lyrical story that again is not flashy in our modern sense, and yet conveys everything with enough style and grace to give us a sense of the hand that drew it and the hand that wrote it. So that was that. I hope you enjoyed it. I highly recommend you picking this up, and I hope that I can get the copies of the Buddha, the volumes, so that we can take a look at those. I'd like to go into Astro Boy because that's pretty much where it all started, and just take a look at as much of this as we can. So over the next 3 videos, we're going to go in a completely different direction. They'll probably be much shorter videos. But I thank you very much for your time. I hope you're learning something from all of these. I hope you're grasping something. If nothing else, I hope that it just, inspires you to pull out your comics and just take a deeper look at them and study them, so that we can, pull what we need from them for our own comics. So that, again, we're not just making more comics, but we're making better comics as well, whatever that might mean. And with that, I thank you, and on to the next one.